Oh, I'm looking forward to this. Another episode starting in Zephaniah. It's taken some time, but boy, have I learned a lot. I hope you have too, as we've been taking this journey through with Voices of Zion. And today, back in Zephaniah, we got through verse 15. Hey, how about verse 16,
This
Rabbi?
is the scenic route, right? So
That's
it's
right.
not to get to some particular goal at the end of it all. It's to really pay attention to all the scenery along the way.
Got to stop
Okay,
and smell the roses.
so we begin now with verse 16. I'll just note that in the Masoretic text, this is the last section in Zephaniah, from verse 16 through 20, the closing verse of his prophecy. In that day, and we already understand what day that is. That's the day of ingathering, the day of restoration. In that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, fear you not, and to Zion, let not your hands be slack. Fear is reactive. Hands going slack, in a similar vein, is kind of like being paralyzed and not being proactive. And the message to Jerusalem and Zion, which are essentially two names of the holy city, is be proactive in a positive way. And that inevitably leads to the consolation that will be the basis of this proactivity. The Lord your God is in the midst of you, a mighty one who will save. He will rejoice over you with joy. He will be silent in his love. He will joy over you with singing. An interesting set of metaphors. Of course, on the most basic plane, he will be silent in his love. In his love, he will not recall the iniquities that resulted in the destruction in the first place. That is, on some level, the implication, it's time to move on. And of course, that very much coheres with you be proactive. Don't be afraid. Don't let your hands go slack. Don't be paralyzed by the past. This is something that, apart from Jerusalem, I think we can all identify with, right? That is, it is all too easy, but debilitating, to allow the past to rule over us and not enable us to be able to move forward. On the one hand, we have to deal with the past. We can't just ignore it. But simultaneously, we can't be paralyzed by it, because if we do, then we become its prisoners and we aren't able to move on.
So that word that you are, and it's fascinating to me. In the King James Version of the Bible, it says he will rest in his love. And in your case, it says he will be silent. The word I would pronounce it ḥāraš or something along those lines.
The verb is ḥāraš.
There you go.
So maybe just to place it in a parallel context to appreciate its implication, in Exodus chapter 14, when Moses is reassuring the people as they are with their backs to the sea and they see the Egyptians are in hot pursuit. And the expression is very similar to what we're reading in Zephaniah here. In verses 13 and 14, Moses said to the people, fear not, Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show you this day. For as you have seen Egypt this day, you will not see them again anymore forever. The Lord will fight for you. And here's where we get to the same word. Ve'atem tacharishun. And you'll be silent. You'll be passive. You'll be at peace. There are a number of possibilities here. The truth of the matter is that rest is not something that's incorrect or off the charts. But there is this implication that we often find in ḥāraš of being passive, being quiet, being silent.
Yeah, in some cases, and again, it may be the root of the word, and I'm not that linguistically, educated as you are, but there's this idea of engraving and plowing that it's sometimes translated that way.
So that's true. The same three-letter root. Now I have to admit that I don't have any explanation of this. The same three-letter root, chet, resh, shin, is the root of plowing. It is also in the noun form the description of someone who is deaf.
Really?
Where the implication of ḥāraš as a noun, as a description of someone, really in its original sense is a deaf mute. Now, of course, we appreciate that in an era before there were therapies and technological aids, most people who were deaf were inevitably mute because they never experienced sound and never learned how to produce sounds. But then there is that aspect of ḥāraš, then corresponding to that sense of being silent. Now, an interesting question is what that has to do with plowing. And I have to admit, I can't, off the cuff, come up with any proposition for what the connection would be.
Well, and again, it seems like the word's used for peace, like in the King James Version, and that where the passage that you referred to in Exodus, it's translated there as peace. That again, the way it is, the Lord shall find you and you shall hold your peace. Again, using the same word but it's just translated peace, silence in your case. And when I think of hardened ground, the opposite of plowing. In other words, clearly there's plenty of passages where you got to, break up the fallow ground, and that fallow ground doesn't have any peace because it isn't fertile. It isn't bearing any fruit. And there's certainly the fruit of peace is fruit. I mean, and I don't know. That's just, in our case, Jesus talked a whole lot about the parable of the soils and how important keeping the ground, fertile was to the whole situation. But I just find the whole discussion fascinating. The other thing about the verse, going back to Zephaniah for a minute, not to just go off in 40,000 directions, but that's where my mind always goes, is that it's very similar to me, not just to what you're describing in Exodus, but it's very similar to the second chapter of the Song of Solomon, in that especially the lover is leaping for joy, and he is, rejoicing over, singing over here. The winter is past, the time of the singing has come, and it's the same kind of thing that when you really think about this day of ingathering, the winter is finally past, and
the winter of exile,
right? And the that rejoicing that that the lover is describing there is the same type of feeling to me.
Look, on some level, of course, we definitely understand the implications of the parable in the second chapter of the Song of Songs as the redemption, in particular, the second chapter is often expounded as intimating the redemption from the Egyptian exile. So the correspondence, of course, between that and Exodus chapter 14 would really be very overt. Time of singing is come because soon after the splitting of the sea, Israel will be singing that song of thanksgiving to God of Exodus chapter 15. If I may share with you something, I must admit, this comes to me also as we're speaking right now. This is a question that does not have an explicit answer in Scripture, but we have one in our tradition. Who invented the plow? Nowhere explicitly stated in the Bible, but our tradition links the answer to a somewhat enigmatic verse that we read at the end of Genesis chapter 5. Specifically, in verse 28, Lamech lived 182 years and begot a son, and he called his name Noah, saying, "This one will comfort us for our work and the toil of our hands because of the ground which the Lord has cursed." What's so enigmatic about that verse? Well, the root that underlies the name Noah is not the root that underlies comfort, console, which is the verb that appears as an explanation of the name. That is, to be precise, while one might think that Yenachamenu will comfort or console us, sounds like Noah. That is no, because the root of Noah's name is, for the Hebrew experts, Nun Vav Chet, Noach. The root of consoling is Nun Chet Mem. Consoling, Lenachem, Nachum. So if anything, if the verb Lenachem is the basis of Noah's name, he should have been called either Nachum, one of the prophets, indeed, whom we encounter in the 12 minor prophets, a couple of prophets earlier on in the list before Zephaniah, whom we're discussing at present, or perhaps Menachem, which would also be derived from that three-letter root. But how do you get to Noah? And here's where the tradition, as a kind of level of accretion over the text, kicks in and says, well, what's the consolation that Lamech is ascribing to Noah? That he will console us from the work of our hands, the sorrow of the earth that the Lord has cursed. And of course, this inevitably is a reversion to the consequence of the sin of Adam and Eve, which we discussed last time. That is the sin of seeking to be creative, by consequence of which they will need to bear the consequences of creativity. And the consequences of creativity will include that, of course, the most creative act possible, childbirth, will be with agony. That's what God says to Eve. And for the half of humanity that cannot engage in that supreme creative act, the most creative act in which the male can engage is trying to coax sustenance from a recalcitrant earth to feed those babies. And that's also going to hurt, because you'll raise up briars and brambles and eat the grass of the field. And only through the sweat of your faces will you eat bread. Now, I've given a little bit of a spin on the appropriate translation of those words. Truth of the matter is that we also have a tradition to regard you will eat bread through the sweat of your faces as consolation, not a curse. The previous verse was, you'll bring forth briars and brambles and eat the grass of the field. So again, we have this overlay of our tradition. When Adam heard that, his eyes gushed tears. I'm going to eat grass like an animal? Shall my beast and I be eating out of the same trough? And God says, no. Through your sweat, you'll eat bread. You're not an animal. But how do you get to that bread? You need to learn how to farm. And if you learn how to farm, you know you need a plow. Because without a plow, as you expressed it, nothing's going to come out. The hard, recalcitrant earth won't deliver its bounty. And that's all, on some level, subsumed within, he'll be bringing forth briars and brambles. And you're right, that is, on some level, the earth is generating, but what's generating is not productive. So it's in a kind of race of production without any goal or destiny. And Noah produces the plow. Again, not expressed in the text, but this is our tradition that Noah was the one who invented the plow. And finally, people could, on some level, experience what's the root of Noah's name? Rest, not consolation. Because of the plow, there was the consolation that led to the rest. Noach, rest. It's a different word for rest than ḥāraš. Granted, there are pseudo-synonyms in Hebrew. I say pseudo-synonyms because they aren't identical in meaning. There are always nuances, but that's the way we would render Noach. Calm, at rest, at ease. And what makes the earth at ease from this constant production of worthless, useless produce, the briars and the brambles. Of course, we realize they have their own ecological niche, but that's not the point here. With respect to that endeavor to feed those babies, you're not going to give them briars and brambles. So the earth rests from that because you've plowed it. You have redeemed it from that recalcitrance, the curse of not being able to produce. And now, as it were, the earth rests and you rest too. So maybe that's the connection between ḥāraš in the sense of the deaf mute, in the sense of being silent, in the sense of being at rest, and in the sense also of plowing.
That's amazing. And but you brought up another couple questions as you went through that I have always marveled at Noah's name. I've always marveled at it. I mean, since one of the very first things I began to study in Hebrew when I began to study it was Noah's name, because, I saw this fascinating lecture on it, and this particular rabbi that was teaching on it was very much into gematria, and he was talking about how Noah's name was grace spelled backwards, and Noah was the first person to find grace in God's eyes. And so along those lines, in this particular passage that we're talking about in Genesis 5, his name is just a nun and a het, right?
Right.
There's no vav in there. But when you described it, you said there was a vav.
No, that's just linguistically, we appreciate that there are different conventions here, but the dominant paradigm for understanding biblical roots is to always see it in terms of a 3-letter root. But if the middle letter of the 3-letter root is a vav, it often drops out.
Really?
And the truth is, there are those who would say, let's not even describe it as a 3-letter root, we'll describe it as a 2-letter root. And it's a bone of contention among grammarians. Just take a simple case in point that I imagine is familiar to many people, the root of coming, bo. So again, here, will you describe it as a 3-letter root, bet vav aleph, or will you simply say, drop out the vav and it's bet aleph? Likewise, return, shuv. Again, you could say it's just the shin and the bet, or put in the vav. But the point here, of course, will be that in Noah's name there is no vav, and if anything, that corresponds very well to the talk that you heard, because chen, grace, is also just the chet and the nun, no extra letters.
Right, and so but then when I think of the word grace and the peace that comes as a result of that, and the comfort that comes as a result of that, I also am feeling that whole thing. And I also thought, if Adam was gushing tears at that first curse, which, by the way, that was a beautiful teaching. Then when God said, yeah, I don't blame him too, that when he said you're going to eat bread and by the sweat of your brow, I could see that brought peace too. And that, in other words, whoo, thank goodness, that really rich stuff. I'm glad we went there.
But it still took 10 generations to get there. Noah, after all, is the 10th generation from Adam.
Yeah, no doubt.
It's a process.
It was. But at the point that it's fascinating that here, all those things are coming back in Zephaniah. And now, God is saying, hey, this is coming full circle. But at the same time, the silence is brought out. There's no joy. There's no doubt there's the rejoicing and there's the singing. And, you get a sense of peace that of that day, that, like you started out by saying in that verse, on that day is the day.
I think there's an additional dimension that we could also discuss with respect to the process described in this verse. And of course, I revert to the beginning about do not fear and let your hands not go slack, where coming on the heels of the realization that there was sin, there was rebelliousness. This is, again, a challenge that we each face in striving to chart a course back home to Shuvah, to God, after having stumbled and fallen. And this actually pertains to something that's, I guess, a little bit on my mind now, in particular, because it also pertains to the Torah portion that we're going to be reading this coming Shabbat, which introduces the tabernacle and the vessels thereof, and orients us in particular to considering, while we're getting into biblical roots here, the 3-letter root, kaf, pei, resh. Now, I'm not sure, we may have already discussed this, but kaf, pei, resh is a root that is undoubtedly familiar to many because of Yom Kippur. And it's
biblical
name Yom HaKippurim, but the same idea, that is Kippur, which we generally translate as atonement. And I have to admit that I feel a little bit inadequate in discussing atonement because, honestly, I don't have a clue what atonement means in English. But I think I have a sense of what the root kaf peresh, lechaper, means in Hebrew. And inevitably, where we need to begin here is the first instance in which it appears in the Bible.
Getting back to our friend.
Did we discuss this already?
Well, we have it some time ago, but you can't. But I'm just very familiar with the word you're describing, and I'm also very familiar, with the use of that word there. And again, in Christian circles, that does lead to atonement and those things. But it's an amazing discussion, and there's no doubt that it's key to what you're describing, and I think it's beautiful. So I mean, carry on. I love it.
Okay. So we then turn first to the initial instance in which this root appears in the Bible, which is in the context of the story of Noah. It is in Genesis chapter 6, verse 14, where the root appears twice. But don't look for atonement. Not in the translation, and also not in the sense in which it's employed in the Hebrew. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make it of compartments, and pitch it from without and from within with pitch. And the three-letter root that we're rendering as atonement, of course, is pitch, which appears in this verse as both verb and noun. Pitch, tar, atonement. At this point, it may not be obvious, but when we consider the second example, maybe a pattern begins to emerge. The second instance in which we encounter this root is in Genesis chapter 32, specifically in verse 21. The context is our father Jacob is readying a lavish gift to his brother Esau to assuage his anger. And we read in the preceding verses about how he instructed the servants who are going to bring the gift to him to speak to his brother. And in verse 21, you shall say, your servant Jacob is also after us. So appreciate where things are heading as he encounters the gift that Jacob is following. For Jacob said, achapera fanav, which if we had to translate it literally, I suppose we should translate as, I will cover up his face of fury, of rage, with the gift that is going before me, and afterwards he will see my face. Perhaps he will be gracious to me. I will cover up that face of rage. Achapera. Most translations will render it as I will appease, but again, to render it literally, to cover up the wrath. That's the second instance. Again, a pattern might be emerging at this point. I think it becomes successively more obvious when we consider the third instance in which this root appears in the Bible. We still haven't gotten to a single instance of atonement, of course. It is in Exodus chapter 16. In Exodus chapter 16, of course, we read about the manna. And in verse 14, we read that after the dew had fallen round about the camp, the dew rose up, and behold, upon the face of the wilderness, there was something thin and flaky. Thin as the frost upon the earth. And where are we going to encounter our three-letter root of lechaper here? The frost. Where it's, of course, important for us to bear in mind that in Hebrew, we have a word for snow, which is sheleg. We have a word for ice, which is kerach. And this is neither. This is frost. And yes, here in the land of Israel, we do get our chilly days, so we know what snow means, and we know what ice means, and we know what frost means. But what's, of course, unique to frost isn't the ice or the snow, it's what covers over the ground.
Exactly.
Sorry?
I said exactly.
Yeah.
And that poses all sorts of phenomenal questions that I guess we're going to have to leave this episode for people pondering. Like, we're going to revisit this word kofer.
So if I could just give one final example before we break, if I may.
All right.
The fourth place is the one that's most on my mind right now, because we'll be reading it this Shabbat in synagogues around the world. After all, we read about the construction project of the tabernacle, and the first vessel of the tabernacle that is described is the Holy Ark. Its construction is described in Exodus chapter 25 from verse 10 and on. And the second thing that is described, beginning in verse 17, is the ark cover. What's the word for ark cover? Kaporet. Same root. So we have all the hints we need to be able to solve this conundrum and also bring it back full circle to Zephaniah chapter 3. I guess we should continue on that note.
Yeah, plus it gives me some time to study that word a lot before we reconvene, because I really want to. I want to look at all those passages and see what God will show me. As what a fascinating. We've talked about it before, but we have never gone into the frost and the present to Jacob. To Esau from Jacob. This is much to study and consider. I hope you enjoy studying it as I do. And once again, shalom, my friend. It's an amazing study today. I'm really, really grateful.
It's such a blessing when we're able to take away the screen. The screen, I don't mean the screen of the computer. I mean the screen that interposes between us and the text. Now, the translations always get in the way, and we only see what we see through the screen. So now we take away the screen, and we can see the text.
I can hardly wait. Thank you, Rabbi.
Shalom, shalom.
Shalom.
Okay, so